Once the face of fame, what happened to these 1960s Hollywood legends? Their faces were everywhere. Audrey Hepburn on every magazine cover, Marlon Brando on every movie poster, Elizabeth Taylor on every front page of every newspaper in the world. They were not just famous, they were immortal, or so it seemed. But here is the question no one asks at the height of the party. What happens when the music stops? Tonight we go back to Hollywood's most intoxicating decade, the 1960s, and we follow the stars who burned brightest, and then, one by one, began to go dark. Some disappeared by choice, some were pushed out, some simply couldn't survive what fame had made of them. This is their story, and it is far stranger and far sadder than anything they ever filmed. Introduction to the Golden Age. To understand what happened to these legends, you first have to understand what it meant to be a star in 1960s Hollywood. It was not merely celebrity, it was a kind of royalty. The major studios still controlled everything: your image, your roles, your public persona, and sometimes even who you were allowed to love. Stars like Rock Hudson lived double lives because the studio demanded it. Doris Day smiled through personal chaos because her contract required it. The machine manufactured mythology, and it was very, very good at its job. Audiences believed in these stars completely. They lined up around city blocks to see Cary Grant, to watch Audrey Hepburn float across a screen, to experience the volcanic, almost frightening presence of Marlon Brando. There were no smartphones to pull back the curtain, no TMZ, no leaked texts. The public only saw what the studios allowed, and what they saw they adored without reservation. For a brief blazing moment, these men and women were untouchable, but the 1960s were also a decade of revolution. And in Hollywood, revolutions always have casualties. Audrey's success. For most of these legends, success arrived like a thunderclap. Take Kim Novak, a laundry worker's daughter from Chicago, discovered at 20 years old, transformed overnight into Columbia Pictures' greatest weapon against Marilyn Monroe. By 1958, she was the #1 box office star in America. Or consider Troy Donahue, the blue-eyed, blonde-haired idol who had teenage girls screaming outside theaters the way they'd scream for rock stars. Fan mail by the truckload. A face on every teen magazine in the country. And then there was Montgomery Clift, perhaps the most gifted actor of his generation, more raw and electric than almost anyone who came before him. Marlon Brando himself said that Monty was the better actor. These were people who had everything the world told them to want: fame, money, adoration, and for a few extraordinary years, they had it all at once. The tragedy is always the same. They believed it would last. It never does. It never does. Intominance. At the peak of their powers, these stars didn't just make movies, they made culture. Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's in 1961 didn't just play Holly Golightly. She invented a new American ideal of elegance that women are still imitating today. The black dress, the pearls, the cigarette holder, all Audrey. Elizabeth Taylor, meanwhile, was something else entirely, a force of nature so overwhelming that her production of Cleopatra in 1963 became the most expensive film ever made and nearly bankrupted an entire studio. Her affair with Richard Burton was not just gossip, it was international news. The Pope wrote about it, the United States Congress discussed it, Marlon Brando rewrote the rules of acting, Natalie Wood was the girl next door that all of America loved, Steve McQueen made cool look effortless, and he knew it. These were the people that defined an entire decade. And then, slowly, almost invisibly, the ground beneath them began to shift. One around, the turning point. Every great fall has a hinge, a single moment where everything quietly changed direction. For Montgomery Clift, it was a car crash in May of 1956, right in the middle of his most dominant years. He drove into a telephone pole leaving Elizabeth Taylor's dinner party. His face was shattered, his jaw was broken in 4 places, and when he came back to screens, something in him had gone out, not just physically but somewhere deep inside. He turned to alcohol and prescription drugs, and never quite came back from that night on Coldwater Canyon Drive. For Kim Novak, it was the studio system itself. Columbia chief Harry Cohn treated her like property, once reportedly loaning her out to Sammy Davis Jr. to create a PR scandal, then quickly ending their relationship to avoid controversy. She was a product, and when the product began to resist, the studio lost interest. Troy Donahue watched his career collapse almost in real time. One bad film, then another. The fan mail stopped, the phone calls dried up. By the mid-1960s, the boy who'd been on every magazine cover was all but invisible. Hollywood could make you a legend in a year. It could erase you just as fast. Career collapse or disappearance. Sandra Dee was 18 years old when she was the biggest teenage star on the planet. By the time she was in her mid-20s, the world had moved on to someone younger, and she was quietly destroyed by what the fame had required of her. She battled anorexia and alcoholism for decades. A young woman consumed by the image she'd been sold as a girl. Montgomery Clift made his last film, The Defector, in 1966. He died of a heart attack that same year, at 45, alone in his New York townhouse. His housekeeper found him. The autopsy listed heart disease as the cause of death. Those who knew him said the real cause was longer and slower and sadder than that. Troy Donahue spent years in near poverty. The man who once had a fan club with over 1 million members appeared in exploitation films, bit parts, and eventually became a footnote, only briefly rediscovered when Francis Ford Coppola cast him in The Godfather Part 2 as a small ironic nod to the mythology of fame itself. Kim Novak retreated to a farm in Oregon and stopped making films almost entirely. She said later that Hollywood had nearly broken her, that she had gone to Oregon to find out who she actually was, beneath everything the studio had built. The industry that built them had no mechanism for grief. No severance, no farewell. The marquee simply got a new name on it. Monsterdom. Public reaction. When these stars began to fade, the public didn't know how to process it. Fans wrote letters asking where their heroes had gone. Gossip columnists ran speculative pieces that were often more cruel than curious. The same press corps that had canonized these men and women in the 1960s now treated their decline as entertainment. The studios offered no protection. Their contracts had been fulfilled. Their commercial value had expired. They were on their own. Some tried to mount comebacks and were met with polite indifference. Some gave interviews that revealed the toll, the loneliness, the confusion of a person who had been worshipped and then abandoned by the same world. And the public, that vast, adoring public that had once packed theaters to see them, had already moved on. James Dean was gone. Marilyn Monroe was gone. The decade that had glittered was closing, and with it, the legends it had made. DVLEDZC today, but here is what endures, the work. When you watch Montgomery Clift in A Place in the Sun today, you are watching something so alive, so achingly human, that it stops you cold. You forget there's a screen between you. You forget 60 years have passed. When Kim Novak turns to face the camera in Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, one of the greatest films ever made, she is not a faded star. She is a revelation, luminous, mysterious, completely in command. Audrey Hepburn never faded. Her image is on tote bags and dorm room posters right now, today, worn by people who weren't born until decades after she stopped making films. And Marlon Brando, whatever became of his later years, changed the language of acting so completely that every serious performer who came after him owes him a debt. Legacy is not what happens while you are famous. It is what remains when the fame is gone. And for the true legends of 1960s Hollywood, the ones who gave something real and irreplaceable to the camera, what remains is extraordinary. Mujum Weinzeld. Audrey Hepburn once said, "Nothing is impossible. The word itself says I'm possible." She was talking about life. But she could have been talking about memory, about what it means to leave something behind that the world keeps returning to long after you're gone. Montgomery Clift is gone. Sandra Dee is gone. Troy Donahue is gone. And yet every year, new eyes find them on old screens and feel something they didn't expect to feel. Recognition, tenderness, the strange grief of loving someone you never knew. Fame is a strange kind of light. It blazes without warning. It makes you visible in ways you never fully prepare for. It can ask of you more than any human being was ever meant to give. And then, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, it goes out. But the people who stood inside that light, who gave everything they had to the improbable art of pretending, who made audiences in darkened theaters feel less alone in the world, they were real. They were here, and somewhere tonight, on a screen somewhere, they still are. Once the face of fame, always part of its story.